Like him or not, Goldberg is a stone-cold legend in the world of wrestling. A veteran of the ring since 1996, he's made an unmistakable mark across both WCW and the WWE. But on an episode of the Talk is Jericho podcast, there was a point in his life when Goldberg was just about done with wrestling. In this video, we'll talk about what almost made him quit and why he chose to stay. The feud between Goldberg and the WWE technically started right after the WCW collapsed. We've all heard the stories of the WWE and WCW, two titans of broadcast wrestling TV, duking it out over the ratings. While the WCW once had the one-up on the WWE, Vince transitioned the company into its Attitude Era and blasted full speed ahead of their competition. When the Monday Night Wars ended in 2001, with Vince McMahon buying WCW from AOL Time Warner, he ended up inheriting a few of their wrestlers, but he passed on Goldberg. That might come as a shock to some current wrestling fans, because it can sometimes feel like Goldberg gets a push in the WWE that he doesn't really need at this point in his career. But the fact was that AOL Time Warner owed him too much money, and Vince didn't want to be on the hook for that. So Goldberg was left in the Coldberg. Being snubbed by the WWE in 2001 might actually have worked out in his favor. He sat out the controversial invasion angle. While many of his WCW co-stars were embroiled in one of the most embarrassing storylines in WWE's history, Goldberg took a gap year to wrestle in Japan. He returned to mainstream American wrestling in 2003 by signing a one-year contract with the WWE. On the new episode of Talk is Jericho, Goldberg told Chris that his first year at the WWE was rough. You'd think that the sentiments around WCW would have faded by the time Goldberg joined the WWE, but apparently not. Vince gave him a cold reception, and he was treated like an outsider in the WWE locker room since day one. Because of this treatment, Goldberg describes this year as the most stressful year of his life, and he was with the WCW all the way to its end. There doesn't seem to be a concrete reason behind this chilly reception at the WWE. By this point, there were many former WCW wrestlers who'd become a big part of the landscape at their new home. That even included Booker T, one of the biggest victims of the invasion. Our best guess would be that Goldberg was to the WCW what Brock Lesnar was to the WWE, and it would take a while for wrestlers to forget that association. He was so bothered by this reception that he, in his own words, lobotomized himself at the company. In fact, he sometimes thinks his mind has made up some of the worst incidents that he suffered during that one year. With all this going on, it's no surprise that Goldberg chose not to renew his contract with the WWE when it ended, although he did get a match at WrestleMania 20 with rising star Brock Lesnar. Fun fact about that WrestleMania match though, it was guest refereed by Stone Cold Steve Austin, who was annoyed at the lack of effort the two were putting in and kept prodding them to put on a show. Also annoyed were the fans, who didn't mince their words in their chants. We can see now why Goldberg was so out of it during this match, and Brock Lesnar was also on his way out of the company. You can always trust Stone Cold to entertain though. After Lesnar responded to the audience's chants by giving them and Austin the middle finger, they both ate stunners. Austin followed that up by cracking open a few beers, as usual, and the match ended with at least one positive moment. Luckily, when Goldberg gave the WWE a second shot in 2016, things played out much better. He took a long break from wrestling at the end of his WWE tenure before returning to the ring in 2015. He was at the Legends of Wrestling show, held at Citi Field in New York. While Goldberg didn't have a bout on the card, he did interfere to help his old co-worker Rob Van Dam against his other co-worker Scott Steiner. He also bestowed a spear on Steiner and a jackhammer on Doc Gallows. That must have given him a taste for the limelight, because he made an interference at 2016's Legends of Wrestling 2, and then a few months later, his second run in the WWE began. This go at the WWE has been a lot more successful than his first. He got to resume his feud with Brock Lesnar, one of the company's top stars, right out of the gate. Another highlight, or lowlight depending on who you ask, was getting to wrestle none other than The Undertaker and The Fiend at two Super Showdowns in Saudi Arabia. He has even held one of the company's top championship belts. Specifically, he's had two reigns as the WWE Universal Champion. But while the locker room is happy to work with Goldberg now, he isn't entirely welcome in the new company even now. Ironically, it's the WWE Universe that now dislikes having Goldberg around. Some would argue that being in the twilight of his career, he isn't the draw he used to be. Many of the folks watching wrestling today weren't even born when Goldberg was in his prime. A big chunk of the wrestling fandom is annoyed that Goldberg has to be given attention that's usually taken away from newer talent at the company. His squash of The Fiend at Super Showdown is often said to be the beginning of that gimmick's downfall, and The Fiend was one of the most exciting gimmicks the company has had in recent times. Still, Goldberg is pretty happy with where he's at right now. Vince was happy to have him around, the wrestlers were happy to work with him, and he himself was content to pop by the ring every now and then to throw a few spears. Say what you will about the man, but he's living his best life. In other news, did you know that Goldberg was there when the WCW suffered its killing blow? That probably isn't so surprising, since Goldberg was everywhere in the WCW, but it was actually a match involving him that may have signed the company's death warrant. It wouldn't be fair fair to say that Eric Bischoff isn't a good manager. He's the one who piloted the WCW through its early success in the Monday Night Wars. But his fatal flaw was that TV ratings were all that mattered to him, even more than actually making money for his company. It was in the pursuit of Monday Night ratings that he booked Goldberg against Hulk Hogan, with Hogan's World Heavyweight Championship on the line. If you want to see how insane of a booking decision that was, imagine Roman Reigns and Brock Lesnar fighting for the two top belts of the company this week on Raw. A match of that caliber should be on a pay-per-view, and the WCW's booking here cost them a huge chunk of money. While that wasn't the only huge chunk of money WCW left on the table, it was part of why the WCW didn't have enough money to save itself in the end. Not only did AOL Time Warner jettison it, they sold it to Vince really cheap. Speaking of Vince, the investigations against him have tied him to Donald Trump. The 45th President of the United States is now the most controversial man in the whole country, and like him or not, being associated with him can be bad for your image. That is why the latest development in the ongoing saga of Vince's embezzlement is bad news for him. Remember that weird period when Donald Trump was making appearances on the WWE? Not only did he not do that for free, but Vince apparently paid the Trump Foundation $5 million in secret money in return for those appearances. You'll remember that the Trump Foundation doesn't exist anymore. Trump had to resolve it after it was found he used funds from that charity towards his election campaign expenses in 2016. Did Vince make a campaign contribution from WWE's funds on purpose, or did he not know what the money would be used for later? The $5 million were just a small part of the $20 million that Vince has made disappear from his company's accounts. Most of it was used as hush money to victims of sexual assault, but we can only wait and see where the rest went. And finally, we have good news about Becky Lynch. While the twist ending of Becky's match with Bianca Belair was really great, it came at the cost of Becky suffering a shoulder injury. Thankfully, she shared an update on her situation in an Instagram live conversation with The Rock, and the news is good. She told him that her shoulder is healing up quickly and that it's already feeling better than ever, but she didn't give a time frame of when she'd be back. The WWE told us that she'd be out for several months, but let's hope her news is a sign of an earlier return. That's it for today's video. What do you think of Bill Goldberg? Were you watching him during the WCW days, or are you just now catching the train during his late career run at the WWE? If you were watching him in WCW, share your thoughts in the comments below. But don't go anywhere without liking, sharing, and subscribing.